Dr. Aaron Brantly has over a decade of experience in international development with a focus on information communication technologies, bringing a unique point of view to the cyber decision-making process. He is currently an assistant professor of cyber and international relations in the Department of Social Sciences, cyber policy fellow in the Army Cyber Institute, and cyber fellow at the Combating Terrorism Center. He holds a Master of Public Policy degree from the American University and a PhD from the University of Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Aaron Brantly.
Test, is this on? If you can hear me, hopefully. First, I want to just say thank you for coming out today. And what I'm going to be talking about today is exactly what Colonel Conti talked about in his opening, is thinking about how states decide to engage in offensive behavior from military and intelligence perspectives in this domain that's rapidly evolving. And I have to lay out a caveat. I got into this primarily because there's a gentleman in the back of the room who works at an NGO here in Washington, D.C., who really gave me that opportunity to be creative and innovative. And so in order to think about this, we would think about it in human rights. How are we going to protect people? But oftentimes we want to know, why are people doing something in the first place? We want to know why they're engaging in some type of behavior that we might not like or that we want to stop. In the cyber domain, we oftentimes come at it from a defensive perspective. We want to protect our networks. We want to protect our critical assets. We want to protect the nation in a whole bunch of different ways. But what if we think about it? What if we flip the model on its head and we say, well, how do people decide to attack us in the first place? So I looked through the literature and I found this notion that there's a rational model for understanding when states go to war in conventional conflict. Well, what if we can apply this rational model to cyber conflict? Well, obviously conflict in cyberspace is significantly different than conflict in the conventional domains. Obviously, we don't have tanks. We don't have aircraft. We don't have ships. We have different things that we have to contend with. And so what I'd like to do today is to ask you all to suspend belief for a few minutes and become homo economicus, or rational human beings. When I talk about rationality, I'm not talking about good or bad. I'm literally talking about how you decide between drinking a Coke or a Pepsi. I'm trying to ask you how you decide whether you like apples more or oranges more, and at what point you're willing to switch based on the cost matrix of, say you like Coke and it's $1, how likely are you going to buy a Pepsi if the cost of a Pepsi is 50 cents? And so what I'm trying to get you to think about is, how do states decide from a rational perspective, from this idea of maximizing their own benefit in any given situation, to engage in an offensive attack against another state? And so the research question I started with is, do states rationally decide to engage in offensive military operations against other states? Obviously, we want to know, are they doing this in a rational behavior so we can predict outward? And so what is the goal of this? Well, first, if we can understand this rational model, we can begin to understand some of the concepts of costs associated with states going to trying to wage operations in cyberspace against other states. We can also understand their expected benefits. And if we can understand the expected benefits and the costs associated with it, we can start to develop this concept of a generalized model of deterrence. So we can tweak the costs, we can tweak the benefits, and hopefully we can mitigate some of the different types of cyber attacks against us around the margins. So if I can understand when a state is going to engage in offensive behavior, then maybe I can start mitigating some of those behaviors. Now, to understand this broadly, we're putting together a lot of pieces of a very rapidly evolving puzzle that moves and shifts under our feet. And so, to begin, when we think about rationality in cyberspace, we can't think about it just in this conventional context of power. We have to think about it in terms of several other mitigating factors. So if I go into the boxing ring with Mike Tyson, I'm obviously a lot smaller than he is. He's more powerful than me. The probability is that I'm going to lose. But in cyberspace, we have other mitigating factors that come into this decision matrix associated with power construction. And so we have this notion of power, the ability to influence, but we also have this notion of systemic vulnerabilities or weaknesses associated with our behavior. We also have a fundamental consideration of anonymity. Now I say anonymity and not attribution, because from an offensive perspective, we want to remain anonymous in most, but not all, types of attacks. We want to prevent people from attributing our behavior, at least until we achieve a certain level of objectives for a lot of state-level behavior. Now, I'm talking about states, not sub-state actors. Well, that's another can of worms we can get into. But anonymity, vulnerability, and power combine to create this kind of understanding of a rational concept in cyberspace. And so the first thing that we have to start thinking about is what is anonymity from an offensive perspective. And so here I look at anonymity from three different perspectives. First is the inability to identify the perpetrator of an attack. So if I can engage in an attack and somebody can't identify who I am, then I can muck around in their systems, I can do a lot of great things, and I can get away with it. It's kind of like robbing a bank without getting caught. Okay? And so I want to try and maintain that level of anonymity to some degree. The other thing that I want to be able to do is to hide the fact that an attack might even be occurring. So if I can hide the fact that an attack is occurring, I can engage in tailored access operations or various other types of operations that allow me to get to my target without being thwarted at any point in time. And so the third one is the inability to isolate the target in an attack. If I know that you're moving your tanks in a formation, then I can counter-maneuver in a particular fashion. In cyberspace, we also want to hide the objective of our attacks so that our objectives can be achieved without mitigating factors along the way. Now, in computer science, we look at a lot of these attacks and we analyze them forensically using code and various other types of behaviors. I'm a political scientist by training and a social scientist, and so I look at it from who are my enemies? Who are the people that don't like me, or who are the people that I like? And so I look at it in the notion of what is the scale of attack? Is it a large-scale attack or a small-scale attack? Is it highly complex or is it simple? So as the scale goes up or the complexity goes up, I'd expect that the number of potential people able to engage in this type of attack would go down. The other thing that I'd expect is that I have a pre-existing level of hostility between certain states. It's very unlikely that certain states are going to attack me in cyberspace because we might have a good relationship in advance. And so I can say I'm being attacked or I'm attacking somebody. They might already pen me as one of the potential perpetrators. Now, based on scale and complexity, they can also know that of the states that are hostile to them, that there's only a certain number that have the requisite capabilities to engage in a certain type of attack. And so when I'm thinking from an offensive perspective, I take into consideration this notion of anonymity in this complex format. And I'm able to build a notion of what is my adversary going to see when I am engaging their systems on an ongoing basis. Now, the other thing we have to think about anonymity is time, this notion of time. Now, when I talk about anonymity, I'm not talking about the ability to engage in an attack and never be found out. I'm literally talking about the notion that there's an objective to achieve, and once we achieve that objective, the importance of anonymity can diminish. So if I engage in an objective and I accomplish that objective, so any bit of anonymity I maintain after that point is surplus to me. It's an added benefit to my own operation, and so at some point in time, they're not doing a response action. They're actually engaging in a new type of attack against me. And so anonymity can facilitate this dynamic in international affairs where if I engage in a cyber attack and if they can only attribute it significantly later or respond significantly later, then I can say, hey, they're attacking me now, and so this is something that changes it as well. And so why does anonymity matter? Well, we collect intelligence across the entire time frame of operations as well. And we have to think about this idea of anonymity proceeding back and forth across an operational tempo. And so we can say that as we're planning an attack, as we're beginning the initiation and we're beginning to achieve objectives, that anonymity matters quite significantly. We want to hide what we're trying to do. We want to obscure the fact that we might be engaging in something in a lot of instances. And so we try and understand how we can make this function. And so, but as we get into the post-operative, the AER, the post-op reports and things like that, we want to start, we can say, okay, anonymity matters, but it's not as important as the anonymity on our next mission or something along those lines. And so this can influence the process of decisions from an offensive perspective. And so anonymity basically is, if you could rob a bank, morality aside, would you do it? And most people would say, yeah, if you could rob a bank and not get caught, you'd probably do it. You'd live out your days on some paradise island or skiing in Colorado or something like that, and you'd have a really great time. But what if no one ever knew you robbed the bank as well? And so there's a lot of other things that we consider within anonymity that helps us to condition. So if we don't know that somebody's attacking a system, or if they never know that we're attacking a system, what's to stop me from doing it? If somebody doesn't know that I'm going to attack their system, or if they don't know for a long time, there's nothing really to stop me. And so we see this in criminal behavior a lot as well. Criminals might rob a bank, and because they don't assume that they're going to get caught in the short term, they're going to get caught sometime in the future, and so they discount the risk associated with engaging in that type of operation. And so if we can mitigate this notion of anonymity, then we can mitigate some of this association of rationality. Now, within that original slide of power, vulnerability, and anonymity was this notion of power in specific. And so when we think about power in the conventional sense, we think about how many personnel, how many tanks, how many ships, how many airplanes. We think about our GDP. We think about all these different things. But in cyberspace, where does this fall into our understanding of power? And so I argue that there's a set of things that we have to think about that are what would be best referred to as theoretical power constructs. We have this notion that we have to build military units to defend or engage in offensive behavior in cyberspace. We have to write laws and policies that enable us to know when we can do what to whom and how. We have to engage in developing economic incentives and social incentives that develop engineers, lawyers, technicians, and a whole bunch of other individuals that are going to join our teams that make us more powerful. We have to understand that we need a robust, both technical and industrial infrastructure that is able to mitigate a lot of the vulnerabilities associated with our actions that we might engage in or others might engage in cyberspace. And so, and the other thing is, as a policy person, as long as I throw a lot of money at something, theoretically it's going to get solved. If I throw a ton of money at something, I should solve the problem. That's the way Washington works quite often. If I throw a lot of money at something, I'm going to solve the problem. And so combined, these aspects, if we maximize them, should indicate that we're going to become a very powerful nation. But the reality is a little bit more complex. If I maximize all of these, but I never really use them, then how do I know that a state is powerful? And so I include this idea that there's some sort of demonstrated, and this demonstrated is either an offensive scale or complexity of attack or a defensive protection against a scale or complexity of attack, and I kind of scale these together. But the other thing that we have to think about in terms of power, beyond anonymity, is this notion of vulnerability. If we want to go to war in cyberspace against a country that has very few people that are connected to the internet, then they have a very small attack surface. So we could be extremely powerful in relation to them, and they could have very little vulnerability. So even if they don't maximize all the qualities across theoretical and demonstrated, they are still proportionately equivalent in a lot of ways to us because we have fewer targets. Now, in the converse is that if we engage another country in an operation and they respond back, then we have an enormous number of systemic vulnerabilities across our society. We have an enormous internet penetration. A lot of our allies have enormous internet penetration. And so we have this broad spectrum. So this is something that we also have to consider when we engage in offensive operations in cyberspace, or when any state engages in offensive operations in cyberspace. This notion of how do I project my power and also protect my vulnerabilities? And how does that make for understanding when I should engage in certain types of behavior and not? And so, truth be told, I put them all into a model, this notion of an expected utility model that takes into consideration these power scores based on demonstrated and theoretical capabilities scaled against vulnerabilities. And the United States falls, quite frankly, right near the top. So this is a limited sample, obviously, and so it's a little bit misleading. We are by far the top. So if I added all 192 countries in the world or so on the list, we would be within the top 10, clearly. But we also have to realize that we are a country that has a large number of systemic vulnerabilities across all spectrum of infrastructure, across all spectrums of society. And so that's where the United States falls for right now. Now, when I analyzed this model in aggregate, I looked at 25 cases, each between two different states, in which there was $1 million or more of damage. And I looked at the level of anonymity, and I looked at the level of power, and I looked at the policy positions, both positive and negative, in advance of this offensive behavior between the two states. And I ran the data, and I looked, and I found there's some very fascinating things to take away from this. All 25 incidents that I was able to find in the public domain indicated that states are behaving rationally when they engage in offensive behavior against other states under the conditions of anonymity. If I assume that you're never going to catch me when I rob the bank, it is always rational for me to rob the bank. If I assume that I might not get caught for a very long time, it's almost always rational for me to rob the bank. And so the same thing happens in cyberspace. So as long as there's some measure of anonymity, even if I am proximately powerful to another state, or even if I'm less powerful than another state, it makes sense for me to engage in an operation so long as I have a high degree of anonymity. Now, if I remove anonymity, all but 5 cases become irrational. It almost exclusively becomes irrational to engage in an attack if I know I'm going to get caught. If I know that I'm going to get caught while I'm engaging in an attack, it becomes almost exclusively illogical or irrational to engage in that attack. Now, the only caveat is that if I have far more power than another state in cyberspace, and I engage in an attack against another state, that mitigates anonymity. So I can still engage in an attack against a state that has far less power than me and forget anonymity, or it matters less. But in general, anonymity matters a great deal. The other thing I found is that relative policy changes, both static and changing over time, really don't matter. It doesn't matter if I like you as to whether I rob your bank or not. If I can rob your bank and get away with it, I should do it every single time. Okay? So if I like you or not, I should still steal from you because you're never going to know. Or if you do know, you're not going to be able to punish me for it. And if you can't punish me for it, then what's the point? So the state power is also heavily influenced by this notion of vulnerabilities. So I have to really take into consideration that not only do we need to build strong military power in terms of cyberspace, but we also need to build robust systemic power across the national infrastructure as well. Okay? The next thing that would go in here is that anonymity can be evaluated through the duration of an attack. So any particular attack that we look at, we can actually examine the survival of our anonymity across the duration of an attack. So we can look at some form of offensive cyber operation, and we can predict how long it would be for the average red team or blue team to predict when a particular attack is going to be discovered, mitigated, or we're going to have to change our behavior as we're engaging in it. And last, I would also caveat this, is that these results are based on limited open source data, and they do not take into consideration this notion of cognitive psychology or cognitive behavior. And that's an important caveat. Okay, we're building a writ large general idea of how states decide to engage in making a decision. If we want to start getting into the nitty-gritty of sub-state actors and things like that, we have to bring in 58 different cognitive biases. We have to bring in things such as prospect theory, and et cetera, to understand the nuance of the complexity. But for generalized predictive behavior, we can start establishing by tweaking costs and benefits. And so, what are the big takeaways here? It's good. States are behaving rationally in cyberspace. If we expected them to be doing crazy Ivans all the time, we'd be in a bit of trouble. We'd be in a pickle. But they are actually behaving quite rationally in cyberspace when they engage in this behavior within the constructs of a generalized expected utility model. Okay? And then the other thing that we have to see is that complex anonymity through the duration of an operation greatly facilitates the decision-making process, the ability to be rational. And so what does this mean for us in the future? Well, it means, unfortunately, that mid-level tiers of cyber conflicts are going to continue. Why? Because people can continuously rob banks at the lower levels, the ankle-biter level, and they can continuously do it without getting caught in the short term. And that's an important thing to understand. But the other thing that's important is that we're not going to see the bolt out of the blue, at least the model doesn't predict that we're going to see a bolt out of the blue massive cyber Pearl Harbor, absent some other form of non-anonymous type of kinetic warfare. And that's an important caveat, because if we are always expecting this big bolt out of the blue, then what we know from this model is that the larger the scale, the larger the complexity, the lower the anonymity function becomes over time. And so it becomes less rational to engage in a large-scale attack absent the fact of significant power divergences between two states. And so if two states are going to engage one another, if there's a large state and a small state, we're not going to see a large cyber Pearl Harbor because the level of anonymity would be so low based on that scale of attack that it would become irrational to engage in that type of behavior. Now, is it 100%? No, it's a predictive model, and it's designed to predict broad spectrums of behavior. But in general, we would be less likely to see extremely large-scale cyber Pearl Harbor type attacks than we would be to see this mid-level type of conflict because of this notion of rationality. And so with that, I'll conclude, and I would also like to say that I would encourage you to submit papers to the Cyber Defense Review as well, as I am one of the people who reads them and decides whether to what's needed associated with it. And so if you have further questions, I'm happy to answer them here, as well as provide more additional resources on the model developed in the data as well.
Good morning, sir. Thank you. Jim Dahm from the FAA. Is the intent of your work to try to assess the threat so you can figure out what the probability of an attack is? And if that is the case, is the variability in the data, the model, really can use that to assess your risk and actually make adjustments, because that varies so quickly by the time you actually make the adjustments? Are they really valid anymore?
So yes, the model does predict out, and it does take into account variability. It does enable us to determine who the biggest potential threats would be for any level of type of an attack, as well as, but most importantly, it helps us to predict, if we're engaging in an offensive behavior, what another state might be able to plan in response. So we can use this notion of survival of anonymity over time, and we can predict how successful we think any particular operation, or how much benefit we're going to gain from an operation. And we can also do the same from the counter perspective, how successful we think an opponent's operation would be as well. And it does account for the variability. It's a fairly quick mathematical function that you just need to feed in the data to. It's actually a two-tiered function, but that's another.
Hi, Dr. Jerry Hill
Yes.
from MITRE, supporting USDI.
Okay.
Your model doesn't seem to account for morality when you're looking at rational behavior. Does that not figure into it for nation-state behavior?
No, so morality does not figure into this model. It's a when we talk about homo economicus, rational man, we negate the fact that there's moral behavior or immoral behavior. And so when an economist is predicting whether you're going to buy a Coke or a Pepsi, they're really not looking at the moral decision between, whether you're from Georgia and it's immoral to buy a Pepsi. This is that general concept. And so morality should be something that we take into consideration writ large, but in terms of general predictive, this is not taken into consideration.
Okay, quick follow-up then. We're not talking about buying a Coke or a Pepsi. We're talking about attacking a nation state. That's
Yes.
a little bit different. Robbing banks, that's
right. And
different.
so the notion of morality in general economic policy is also absent as well. So when you look at large-scale macroeconomic policies in terms of broad spectrum Federal Reserve type behavior and things, you oftentimes ignore the morality of any type of behavior. That doesn't mean and so this model is actually based on the expected utility theory of international conflict by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, and it's expanded outward, specifically incorporating attributes of cyber and anonymity. And so the notion of morality is left out, specifically because we are really just going into this notion of rational economic behavior, not in terms of psychological aspects such as morality. Yes, sir.
Doctor, Tim Holden, former operator, now CEO of a company in this space here. Thank you for a very fascinating discussion of anonymity and behavior. I'd really like to understand in more detail what rational behavior is, but that's not the point of my question. Maybe a thought for the future, so that now when the gloves come off and there is no desire or need for anonymity, does a concept like mutually assured destruction in the nuclear sense apply to this space as well?
So I don't go into this in this particular look at it, but the idea is that once it starts going cross-domain,